Thank you, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. First of all, I'd like to thank First Nations for bringing us together. And I think, the space that we have, the intimate space where we can be together as writers in the writing community of the Pacific is so important. So I'm really grateful for that, Anna and your team. Just to talk a little bit about literature and publishing in the greater Pacific, and some of you will know about a lot of this. And I'll focus on Vanuatu and Melanesia because that's kind of where I situate myself. I just want to read you a quote from Albert Wendt, who's a professor and who's done a lot of work in anthologies in the Pacific. He says, "Our writing is expressing a revolt against the hypocritical, exploitative aspects of our traditional, commercial and religious hierarchies, colonialism and neocolonialism, and the degrading values being imposed from outside and by some elements within our own societies." And I would like to say that, to start off by saying that the publishing industry and the space in the Pacific has been very small traditionally. In Vanuatu, for instance, the only publishing house we have is Alliance Française, and they do these little books of poetry. Now, they will only publish your work if you write en français or in Bislama, which is our tok pisin. I'm not a writer in French or Bislama, so that really limits where I can get my stories and other writers like myself, because as I was growing up through school, I was hit for speaking Bislama because you don't speak Bislama in school, you speak English. And so I learned to write in English and I learned to think in English and I put everything aside. And so that's the limitation that we have. The publishing industry is growing. And, for instance, I know we're not talking about children's books, but we've done a couple of children's books and we've self-published because that's the way to go. And I think a lot of the writers here today have self-published.
We can talk about children's books.
Yes, and I think,
Tell us about this one. What is it? Taftumas.
Yes, so it's Taftumas, and in our Tokpisi, in our pidgin, it means, number one, you're strong, you're Taftumas. Because our education system is in both French and English, it's en anglais et en français, and we work with children to do the artwork. And really it's about giving them opportunities to learn about people that have the same experiences as they do and that come from the same cultures. Because as I was saying, as I was growing up, I was learning about Queen Victoria, I was learning about La Tour Eiffel in France. I didn't really understand how that made sense to my life, but we wanted to give children something that represents themselves and they could look at and touch and feel. But also we didn't want to be limited by a traditional publisher, so we said, let's do it ourselves, and we just scraped around, found some money, and got this done, first volume for the 40th anniversary, together with this, the Women's Anthology, and this was just launched in January. This is the second volume of Taftumas, and really the target is to get this out through all schools in Vanuatu, and we've worked with the Ministry of Education to do some of this. The challenges are great and they're still ahead of us.
So the barriers are great to getting the stories out there or the interest in the reading. I understand the publishing side is tough because we ended up publishing, sorry to interrupt, but there is a question. We ended up publishing Joshua's story because to find a publisher who would do it on a reasonable basis, and that every publisher we spoke to wanted to take the copyright. And we just said no, because he must control the copyright, and he does. With us, Joshua has the copyright. It's in the book, it's there, that's it. And so there's those kinds of barriers that aren't well understood as well, I think, that I found. But how's this gone? It looks fantastic.
It's amazing, and it's gone out through all the schools in Vanuatu, and I guess
May
the
I
point...
have a look?
Please have a look. And the point about publishing is, is an important one because, to get into that market of the traditional publishing, we were really lucky with this book. It's actually published by the former Victoria University Press, which is now Te Heranga Waka University Press in New Zealand. And we were able to get a New Zealand grant, and that was only because one of our editors has a connection to New Zealand and studied at the university. I also had a couple of poetry pieces published by them. And so they were willing to look at our manuscript and even consider it, which we were really lucky
How
for.
fantastic.
Because then, you know, the other thing we've talked about, Anna, is the distribution, which is really challenging. And, you know, going through a publisher is one way to do that because they have that set up. The challenges that we face with these books is, you know, we get them out through schools, but to get them further and get the teachers using them is, of course, the other challenge. And so trying to kind of work with the education system to make it accessible to children, because that is our target.
One of our speakers last year was Cecilia, who, together with Mr. Vince's daughter, whose name has just escaped me because I'm old.
Lani.
Lani, I'm so sorry. She's such a fabulous author in her own right and quite famous with respect. She wrote in this, they edited this book, and you're in this book as well. That's on our books of cultural significance because of the diversity around the Greater Pacific and also, you know, just the stories. And your story is several. They're short stories, they're true, it's razor sharp in its expression of the stories, and there's other people here who've been in this book, and it's just magnificent. So could you tell us a little bit maybe about getting this out? But when Cecilia last year was speaking about this, she mentioned how difficult it was bringing it all together as well. So,
yeah, thank you for that. And I would like to acknowledge that there are other writers in this book in the audience, and that's Dahlia, who's also sitting here. I started to write a collection of short stories, and then I submitted, and I thought, oh, select one story. But I ended up getting all my 9 stories in here, and the first story is actually mine. It's called The Girl Who Saw the Moon's Sick. Because we need to talk about menstruation. We need to talk about menstruation in our communities and what we're doing about that, but also the expectation that it raises when a girl becomes of age and she's 12 and she's now marriage material. And what happens with that. And I think, you know, we need to talk about it with our boys and our girls so they understand. And I know, you know, I have so much respect for Lani and Cecilia. They've done amazing. And what they've done is they've actually established a publishing house, Tato Publishing, to, you know, to put this together and bring together 38 writers from across the Pacific. And I think, you know, Torres Strait Islanders as well. I think it's also a Papua New Guinean woman writer in here, and it's all women. And of course, it's very challenging to kind of bring together that. And I'm very lucky. I follow Lani on Twitter, and I saw her putting it out. And actually, just for your information, we've got another book coming out soon, and it's called Fua, and it's a fantasy storybook for children. And I've submitted, and I know that Marlene has also submitted, and that will be being published by Tato Publishing. And I just wanted to make another point with regards to this, Anna, is, you know, and again, I quote Professor Albert Wendt, and who talked about, you know, the kinds of the challenges. So Professor Albert Wendt and Maori scholar and writer Alice Tepunga Somerville, they talked about the place of anthologies, and I think it's so important, and I know we've got other anthologies here from Papua New Guinea, but that often Pacific writers can only get our work published in anthologies because there's such limited opportunities for publishing beyond that. But that doesn't make it any less of value than authors like Joshua who've published a novel, a book on its own. And I think, you know, just acknowledging that, you know, all of that together becomes a site of contestation and a collection of writing that then PhD students could go to and refer to for their research around you know, the work, the literature that's coming out of the Pacific.
That was published in the 40th year of Vanuatu's independence. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to get a few things wrong, but if we could just know that my heart's in the right place every time I say the wrong thing. Don't hit me. The 40th year of Vanuatu's independence, that was a couple of years ago now. How did this come, and you're in this particular book as well, how did that come about?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. So, Sisters Stand Up Strong, and if you look in here, is also the title of one of my poems, and it's basically saying, you know, as women, as sisters, that we are strong and we stand strong. And this really kind of came out after Cyclone Pam, which hit Vanuatu 8 years ago. We've since had, you know, twin cyclones in the last couple of months. But, you know, the challenges that women face coming out of catastrophes like Cyclone Pam. At that time, I was writing a series of stories on domestic violence and had them exhibited as part of International Women's Day. And that's when I kind of met other writers in Vanuatu, Michaela specifically, and we said, hey, why don't we do something, you know? We're both writing, and there's such a small community of writers, so it was sparked 2018, really, and we started the process, we started to talk about it. We didn't know where we were going to get the money, there was no funding for it, and we said, let's put out the call. And so we put out the call, and then in the middle of all of that, I had a baby, and COVID came, cyclone came, and so things were kind of pushed back. But then, you know, we submitted the manuscript to Victoria University Press at that time, and they accepted. They wanted to look at it and wanted to publish. So we were very lucky that they were able to do that, because that meant that some of the costs we then didn't have to take on, as well as Creative New Zealand. And I know, you know, they are such a great support for Pacific writing. There's 36 women published in here, and the stories start from the blackbirding days, which was when Vanuatu, New Hebrideans at that time, were stolen off our islands and brought here to Australia to work in the sugarcane plantations. And so the stories start from there, and kind of move to the sugarcane plantations in Fiji as well, because, you know, people were also stolen, 12-year-old boys off the beach, onto big canoes and taken for work. And then it comes all the way to kind of, you know, the current day and age and independence and what that means for us, and kind of charting our path moving forward. So we've had writers, Vanuatu writers from all over, including Australia, New Zealand, Canada. I think that one of our youngest writer was studying in Canada at that time. We've since had 2 of our writers pass away, one of them just before we launched the book, and one of them this year, Mildred Sope, and I just want to acknowledge her and pay a tribute to her, because she's also one of our prominent poets from Vanuatu, who's written so much and gifted so much of her work to the community. She was telling me that she's written like hundreds and hundreds of poems, and a lot of them she's gifted to people who've asked for it. And she started to write this book, could never finish it. It's called the journey, the miles we walk, and you know, that's what happens. Is often you have a journey that goes and it's unfinished and it's not documented, which is why, for me and for the writing community in Vanuatu, it's so important to get those stories down while people are still alive.
Yes. I'm sad to hear she didn't record her story. That's a very important thing for us. And I think what you're highlighting for First Nations Writers Festival, just to bring it back to us, if I may, for a moment, is what we are hoping to do is to amplify the voices of the Pacific. Last year, Cecilia was the key moderator, speaker at our festival, and she spoke to yourself and others around the Pacific. And it was drawn out that a lot of the publishers strongly edit the work you do to make it more mainstream, is that the right word? To make it more commercial in their view, to make it more along those lines. Is that still the case, and is that still a barrier, do you think, to publishing? Although I note that Sister Stand Up got international media, didn't it, because of its stories. It went over to Europe and the UK and so forth. But is that still the case? today?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like even with Sister Stan Armstrong, there's a couple of poets who wrote in Bislama, and we had to ask them to translate their poetry also into English. So, you've got the Bislama version, but you also have the English version. And I think, this also comes back to the point around kind of making it widely available, because we kind of want our stories to be told outside of the Pacific and to make it accessible for people outside of that. The question around editing, I found it really, really interesting working with Cecilia and Lani on this, because they actually didn't edit much of my work. And they actually didn't ask me to italicize words that I reused in Bislama or in my mother tongue, Tanese, because those are words and it's actually a language that, I speak and is recognized. And why should it be edited and be italicized and made different from the other words that I use in my stories? And so I found this process really, really empowering, and that it's very much a process of collaboration and really having discussions before any final things were made, any final changes and edits were made. That for me is very empowering, and that for me is the way to go with our Pacifica writing and our Melanesian writing.
May I change the subject?
Please.
Thank you so much so far. It's a magnificent dress you have on today. And would you like to share with us some of the history of the design?
I call it the dress of slavery. I wore my dress of slavery today. And actually one of the writers in this book, she refuses to wear it, Rosalind Tor. She's 72 and she just absolutely refuses to wear this island dress, as we call it, or the mother habit.
So is that from Vanuatu only, or is it throughout?
This one is from Vanuatu, and it was introduced, I think Christianity has a lot to answer for, honestly. It was introduced by the Presbyterian Church, and it was, the southern part of Vanuatu, this is what the women wore. And in the northern part where my father comes from, we wear the A-line dresses, so, we're straight and we're formal, and then you've got this mother habit. And so there's some women that to this day refuse to wear it, but then you've got a younger generation that's coming up that's reclaiming it and making it our own, and adding wings so you can fly when you wear them, and ribbons and laces and all kinds of things. And
so
and the
you walk
same
down the street, because people possibly up the back can't see, it's got these strips that just hang down here. What are they? Why were they in the uniforms of the workers back then?
Well, it's like a handkerchief, isn't it? Like you're sweaty. It's like an apron, and you just wipe as you're going and you don't stop. And I think it's the same with literature, is we need to reclaim it. We need to take that back, and we need to take our languages back and put that out for the world to see, because that's sharing a bit of ourselves and our story. And for me, it's about creating an environment of peace and tolerance and understanding through the different things that we do.
Thank you for sharing. Just very quickly, are all these books that you have here for sale?
So I've brought these ones for sale, shipped over from New Zealand, because it's a lot less expensive to ship them over here than to Vanuatu. These ones I have a very limited number of copies, because so I don't have any of that. These I know are available in some outlets. I don't have any copies here, and I think this is actually Anna's copy.
Yes, it's not for sale. Sorry.
It's not for sale. So all the ones that have the yellow stickers. So, but I've got copies of Sister Stan Armstrong. So please have a look and support the women writers in Vanuatu. As I was saying, the sales of these don't come to me. They go into the writers community and a scholarship fund for teacher scholarship. Support and have a look.
I'll give you that back. But the paintings, who did the paintings in that? Was that all local artists?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of children to do the youngest artist in here is 8 years old, and is the grandson of the late Grace Mera Melissa, who's one of our most prolific writers so far in Vanuatu, women writers, I should say also. So yes, we work with children to do the artwork, and there's some adults in there as well.
We're so grateful that people such as yourself, Rebecca, have given up your time to come over here to share with us some of those stories. And is there anything, I mean, you're more than welcome to pop up here any time. I don't want to hog up the front, everybody. I can see that maybe we need to get you up for the next one. But what I'm going to do is introduce Julie Jansen. I'd like to join you. Julie Jansen is an elder of literature here in Australia. She has just been longlisted. I call it a short list. In fact, I see her as the winner, but that's just, you know, on the Miles Franklin. Now, around the Greater Pacific, that may not be known as well known as it is in Australia, but it's Australia's most prestigious book award. And she received that listing for a book that was published, Meduka the Serpent, the River Serpent. And I've read it, of course. It is magnificent. I'm not going to tell you any more about it, but maybe if you would like to, would you mind staying and you can ask some of the questions?